Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie, senior fellow here at Bruegel, and I'm very excited to be talking about the Western Balkan countries today. We have a wonderful lineup. Joining us from Skopje in North Macedonia, Simonida Kacarska, who is the head of the European Policy Institute there. And then from Bruegel, we have our very own Nina Vojanovic, Bruegel's first Western Balkans fellow, and Anna Fiore, one of our research staff. Nina and Anna and our colleague Armin Steinbach have written a paper on this region and some of the trade relationships that are happening there. We're going to tell you all about it. Just to get started, Nina, help us visualize the Western Balkans. Which countries are we talking about and why do they matter?
Thank you very much for organizing this podcast on a very important topic. Just out of curiosity for everyone, there are two concepts. There is a Western Balkan economies and there is also Balkan economies or Balkan Peninsula. The first one is a more geopolitical concept that has been coined around 1998 in the European Council meeting in Vienna. And it encompasses the region called Western Balkans. These are economies on the Balkan Peninsula that are trying to enter the EU but are not there yet. And those are currently Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, and Montenegro. Currently, these economies count 6 countries, which is why often we hear in the literature Western Balkan 6. It is important not to mix this political term with the geographical term called Balkan Peninsula or Balkans, which is an area much larger than Western Balkans and also includes, in addition to Western Balkan 6, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Greece. So to differentiate between the two, the first one really refers to the economies trying to get into the EU, but are not there yet.
And why are they so important right now, given what's happening in Europe and perhaps also what's happening on Europe's eastern borders?
They're important for geopolitically for various reasons. First of all, these are all economies that belong to Europe. The fact that they are part of Europe shows through their economic linkages with the EU. First of all, they're the biggest trade partner to the Western Balkans, are actually EU economies. If you look at the data to demonstrate 70% of the Western Balkan export goes to the EU, and around 60% of the Western Balkan imports actually originates from the EU. That being said, these economies are in Europe. They strongly depend on the EU, yet they're outside the European Union. There are many reasons for that. So besides very strong economic linkages between the EU and the Western Balkans, these economies are staggering when it comes to EU integration process. For example, it has been 21 years for North Macedonia that it has applied for the EU membership. That means that for a very long time, someone who was born in times where North Macedonia applied for the EU membership is currently finishing tertiary education and is ready for the labor market. This is also a very long period of time, for instance, for Montenegro and Albania, who are around 16, 17 years into the EU integration process. So, of course, that this region is important geopolitically because it strives very strongly to be part of the EU, but yet this process has been very, very lengthy for various reasons. And if you want, I can dive into the future avenues of the relationship within these two regions, EU and the Western Balkans.
We will come back to that. First, I'd like to check in with Simonida, and I would love it if you could help us understand where these countries started. Many of them used to be part of Yugoslavia, and then where they're going now. I understand that you've been studying their growth outlook and trying to help them converge with the EU.
Great, yeah. These countries started, most of them with the exception of Albania, as part of the former Yugoslav Federation. And out of that same federation, Slovenia managed in the first round in 2004 to become a member of the European Union and to be very successful from what we know. And Croatia managed to do that by itself in 2013. The rest of them had different pathways. So unfortunately, they were plagued by wars. Most of them in the early 90s. There was a war in Bosnia, and this large followed by a conflict also in Kosovo. And a short-lived conflict in my native North Macedonia. And these conflicts largely defined a different trajectory for these countries than what was the case for Slovenia and the other countries that managed to enter the EU in 2004, 2007. North Macedonia, however, applied at the time already with Croatia for EU membership in 2001. And it signed the Stabilization Association Agreement in 2001 and then became a candidate in 2005. So it was going on the track together with Croatia. The other countries have applied later. So we have now Montenegro, Serbia that are negotiating, Albania also. As of recently, Bosnia has just become a candidate state just a couple of years ago. And Kosovo is still pending, given the fact that some of the EU member states have not recognized it as an independent state. So there's a lot on the table here, a lot of complexities which plague the region politically, also as a result of post-conflict circumstances. But all of them follow this trajectory towards EU membership in their own ways. But what is different than the case of Slovenia that we mentioned before is that for these countries, the path to the EU has become a much longer one. They started, unlike for the previous enlargement in 2004 and 2007, and even for Croatia, in which the accession negotiations with the European Union lasted 5 to 7 years. For these countries, as North Macedonia was mentioned, the accession process already lasts more than 25 years. These extended periods of alignment, of transformation of these countries according to the model of the EU have come with specific challenges because in the meanwhile, the EU has also transformed within, has renegotiated the forms in which it offers membership. It has rethought the ways in which it offers membership to countries. But going back to your previous question as to why are they very important now, I would say that we have to keep in mind that after the Russian invasion on Ukraine in 2022, the issue of enlargement came back to the fore. So we have new candidates very quickly. In addition to the Western Balkans 6, you have Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia with its specific issues now, but new candidates have been recognized, new countries have gained candidate status at the EU level, and the European Union has just become also more aware of the need to enlarge. And it decided to look, and in addition to these candidates, it had to look also back to these 6 countries which have been in the pipeline for a very long time. And in that sense, it also is now attempting, but we can discuss a bit later, to reintroduce new instruments to support their European accession and also potentially their convergence through the recently launched growth plan.
Super. Tell us about your study. What question were you trying to answer about the trade relationships, and what was your general impression after doing it?
So we started from the EU request for deeper Western Balkans regional integration. So we try with our study to explore barriers and also prospect of intra-Western Balkans economic relationship. And we started from some pronounced bilateral economic relation between Western Balkan countries that, of course, are associated with historical path dependencies. In fact, of course, the European Union is by far the leading trade partner for all the Western Balkan countries. It accounts for almost 70% of the regional's total trade. But what surprised us the most was that despite CEFTA, that abolished tariffs on industrial goods and trade between all the Western Balkan countries, the intra-trade is quite limited compared to the one to the EU. In fact, it only accounts for, let's say, almost 18% of exports and 9% of total imports of the region. Also, it is worth to note that this proportion has remained unchanged for the past, let's say, 20 years. In contrast, the trade that does happen within the region is mainly dominated by bilateral relationships between individual countries rather than a broader regional trade network. So in our study, we focus on that.
In the next part of our podcast, I'd like to talk more about these trade relationships. Simonina, can you tell us about the importance of bilateral versus regional trade and sort of what it means for these countries to be part of a broader economy as opposed to just setting up separate relationships with their various trading partners?
Sure. I think first we have to start at the bigger regional integration that these countries aim at is actually the EU accession. So the bigger story, the bigger chunk of the bigger reference framework is the EU accession. And actually, when you're trying to adapt your own model to a model to the biggest market in the world with 450 million people, then that takes precedence over your own small regional bubble. We have to also keep in mind that when we talk about the Western Balkans, we talk about largely not more than at the moment 16 million people in total, which is less than 4% of the EU's population. It's a relatively small area. As I spoke in my previous intervention, by conflicts, re-establishment of borders. 5 of these countries were previously, let's say, prior to 30 years of a joint federation. What they spent most of their times for, at least for 2 decades, was actually re-establishing their borders between themselves and also demarking the borders between themselves, as opposed to what was happening in the bigger market than we are now talking about, which was the European Union abolishing borders. Their infrastructure, and I think this is very well touched upon in the study, the infrastructure between them is far from perfect. The circumstances which have, and as a result of the wars, the political disputes that that were plaguing the region, also their size, their different comparative advantages and so on. As a result of this, actually, most of them have oriented themselves towards trade with the European Union, which at the moment dominates. And also because of the stabilization and association agreements, which were actually signed, as in the case of North Macedonia, 2001, it even preceded the requirement of CEFTA, which came afterwards of the regional agreement for free trade, which also is a smaller version, let's say, of these, which is not so elaborate as the SAAs are, which was introduced a bit later in terms of the regional dimension. As a result, what we see now is that actually the regional trade has been pushed a bit to the background due to the focus of these countries on fostering their relations directly with the EU, also in view of their membership down the road. Now, we also have to make a disclaimer that this CEFTA agreement, actually, it was modeled on, I started also with linking the Western Balkans to the story of the previous enlargement, because actually the CEFTA agreement was originally made for the Visegrad countries, which acceded 2004 and 2007. And it was meant to be also a temporary arrangement until these countries became members of the European Union. Most of them at a certain point just jumped out of CEFTA to the European Union. Now, the problem, going back to also a couple of my earlier intervention, is that the Western Balkans has stayed in the CEFTA arrangement for a very long time. With all of the disputes that these countries have between themselves and a lot of also the complicated consensual decision-making within it has made it just more difficult to achieve, let's say, the maximum of what could have been done through a regional agreement. And not surprisingly, their orientation towards the bigger story, towards the EU, has dominated. And I think this is what we are witnessing and experiencing as well. Now, also, other studies, for example, of the Vienna Institute for International Affairs, have also shown that even the potential of such a small market, even if we had an ideal situation in the region, then the potential of the 15 million people is really not going to be a game changer as opposed to the integration of these 15, 16 million people in the European Union. Should they become members, if we model on the experiences of the previous candidate countries, that is the big changer, especially the couple of years before and after their membership in the European Union.
Nina, should we then look at these trade relationships as sort of a sign of how well these countries are preparing for EU membership in terms of, reducing conflict, working in multilateral situations? Is this something, could we look at better trade as a sign that they're more ready to join the EU?
Are you talking about trade between Western Balkan and the EU or trade within the Western Balkan region?
Because I believe your study is mostly looking at trade within the Western Balkan region.
That's true.
And so my question is, as it gets better, does that then help them with their broader goals?
I think in a way it helps. And let me explain why. Simonida mentioned this is also part of the reconciliation process of this region. The EU has recognized that for a very long time. So as Simonida explained, after the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the EU has introduced a New Year growth plan for the Western Balkan. And in a way, it is a game changer in the approach of the EU towards the Western Balkans. Why? For the first time, EU has introduced a three-step approach into integrating this region with the EU. The first one is enhancing the Western Balkan economic relation with the EU single market, while the second one is talking about the creation of common regional market between the Western Balkan. And that's exactly going to your point. So the first and second point are actually encompassed by the New Year Growth Plan launched in 2023 and active as of last year. And the third part of this package refers to the 6 billion euros package of the European Commission, which should be directed to the Western Balkans, and in particular to the growth-enhancing parts of the Western Balkan economies, conditional on certain progress of reforms. So it is absolutely important and a sign of a progress that that these economies collaborate with one another, but not only politically, but also in terms of trade. Now, we have touched upon CEFTA. Simonida has touched upon that, and she has given some historical background. CEFTA stands for Central Eastern Free Trade Agreement. So it's a multilateral trade agreement that is supposed to make a trade bloc within the region by reducing tariffs of industrial goods. And this is what has been done successfully among the Visegrad economies, because the purpose of this multilateral trade initiative, which is backed by the EU, is truly to integrate these economies into one trade bloc, so integrate them within, and prepare them for the EU. So CEFTA exists in the region as of 2006, and it has encompassed, besides Western Balkan 6, which I listed, and those are Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, North Macedonia, and Albania. It also encompasses Moldova. It did nullify 32 bilateral trade agreements under the CEFTA umbrella, and it has facilitated the trade. This is true. But what this study shows is that the trade within the Western Balkan hasn't been much facilitated, not to extent that this region needs and demands. And of course, reasons are various. Why these economies do not trade within each other, even though there is a trade bloc of a free trade good in which they should operate. The reasons are various, and CEFTA could not address them all. It's really a multifaceted approach which should be applied. But all of these economies, let me go from a broad perspective. Why the regional trade was so poor? All of these economies belong to the lower end of the global value chains, meaning that their technological content is very low. So even though you open the borders for free trade, what do these economies trade with one another? If their economies are not so diversified and if their products are not so technologically sophisticated. In addition to that, we show that, I think Anna Fiora mentioned that even trade in services was very modest between these economies. So CEFTA has not even addressed that until 2019. So even though the trade bloc exists as of 2006, 2007, it has predominantly focused on trade on industrial goods, but not trade in services, which is so important because all of these economies are service-based economies, in particular smaller countries. So no wonder that we see high integration of these economies with the EU value chains rather than among each other. In particular, this is very strong for manufacturing-based economies, such as North Macedonia, Serbia, but also Bosnia and Herzegovina that have strongly integrated over time with the EU value chains. And I will particularly highlight Serbia and North Macedonia. They have automotive industry and are that through trade linkage quite connected with the EU. So the question seems simple, but the answer is, as you can see, complex and reveals that addressing this issue really requires a multifaceted approach. But I would definitely say that higher trade linkage within the region and higher trade linkage between the EU and the Western Balkans is a good sign of the integration process.
Super. I want to just take a brief minute to help our listeners catch up. Simonita, remind us who are the Visegrad countries and how they relate to these Balkan countries.
The Visegrad countries are the Czech Republic, Slovakia, all of the Central Europeans that were acceded to the EU 2004.
So that's Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia?
Slovakia. So basically, some of them, we could even consider these were the countries that, for us, from where we stand, from the Western Balkans, these are the countries that managed to get into the EU on a way quicker track than we did, at a better historical time in Europe, in a much more before the economic crisis. These were the countries also for which the EU has by far had a transformative effect on their economies. For most of them also on ensuring democratic sustainability. And it's probably the model that most of us from the Western Balkans, the supporters of EU integration, the staunch supporters of EU integration, would like us to one way or another emulate, and feel very sorry that we missed that train, to be honest.
Thanks for that explanation. We've been talking about the relative size of economies and countries and populations. Are there things that you found in your research that show where size can be a help or a hindrance, and where you think countries might be able to break out of whatever bucket they're stuck into based on how large or small they are?
We do show in our study, and we reference that through one whole section, that partially because of the size of their economies, but mostly because of the low sophistication of manufacturing value added, they haven't helped much one another in terms of creating, in terms of exporting added value, meaning that, there is no regional value chains here. And it's, of course, very hard to have that when the economies are so small in size. The smaller the market, the more open the market it is, and the more in need a market is for trade with other economies. And of course that a small market cannot satisfy all of its needs through trade within the small trade bloc. So that's just in short saying that the smaller you are, the more open and vulnerable you are to trade. And the more you are in need of the trade integration with the bigger, bigger markets and not smaller markets.
Thanks for that, Nina. Anna, is there anything you'd like to add?
As I said, the region is mainly dominated by bilateral trade relationship. And if we look closer, if we consider the trade with the Western Balkans 6, Serbia accounts for almost 70% of Bosnia intra-regional export and 88% of its intra-regional imports. And if we look at Kosovo, for example, it accounts for about 40% of Albanian intra-regional export. So this pattern of first trade partner dominance within the region is very interesting. And it also is reflected to bilateral agreements. So both Simonida and Nina mentioned the CEFTA, and of course CEFTA allowed trade of industrial goods without tariff. Despite that, these country needs have often required tailor-made agreements that result in a lot of bilateral agreements. This is particular evident in some sector. In our study, we try to compile all these bilateral agreements in one big table in a matrix. Because if we look at transport and energy, but especially at cross-border cooperation, there are a lot of bilateral agreements between these countries. Just to give you a sense of it, for example, Albania and Kosovo have numerous agreements in the areas of infrastructure and transport. Of course, this is coherent with their close and economic and strategic cooperation, especially considering that Kosovo is not recognized by some of the countries in the region. But similar forms of collaboration can be observed also between Serbia and Montenegro and North Macedonia, particularly when we look at trade, FDI, and let's say broader economic cooperation. Similarly, it happens between Albania and Montenegro that they have signed bilateral agreements focused on education and labor market initiatives. The thing is that the reliance on bilateral agreements has its limitation, and as Simonida mentioned before, these agreements tend to fail to foster broader regional integration. They are typically more focused on a specific interest rather than a collective regional strategy. And this represents a big missed opportunity for the region. If the Western Balkans countries could reduce their dependence on bilateral deals and work towards a more integrated regional cooperation, a regional market, they would unlock significant economic growth potential.
Thanks for that. As we move into the last section of our podcast, I'd like to talk about where we go from here. Nina, what is the appropriate time horizon for talking about policy? It's probably longer than 6 months, less than 20 years. What time frame should we be targeting?
Which type of policies? Policies that will draw these economies closer to the EU, or some industrial policies?
The most interesting policies.
Well, nowadays, and I've just mentioned New Year Growth Plan, there is a lot of discussion about Western Balkan economies' integration with the EU because their process has been rather long. And I'm happy that there is optimism that until 2030 that Montenegro, for instance, can get into the EU as the country that is assessed to be the closest to the EU memberships out of all the Western Balkan 6 economies. Then there is a lot of optimism that Albania and North Macedonia can follow suit, while the remaining 3 economies are a bit farther away and need a longer period of time, I would say, in my assessment, beyond the 2030, to put an effort into integrating with the EU. So this is the time frame that has been discussed within the region, but also here in Brussels often as a realistic time frame. And I think New Year Growth Plan can help that. Why? Because New Year Growth Plan has a time frame on its own from 2024 until 2028. And as I said, it has a concrete agenda how to integrate these economies with the EU. I'm very happy to see that some fruits already from the New Year Growth Plan. For example, as of last year, both Montenegro and Albania are part of single European payment area, and as of recently, North Macedonia too. I mean, this is something that will take time to get into the effect, but it is a very important step because it allows these economies to have free of provision transactions with the EU. This is very, very important because not only for trade, but also foreign direct investment. As I earlier said at the beginning of this podcast, all of this region is highly dependent on the EU in terms of trade, but also foreign direct investment. So having the transactions with the EU free of charge and also very fast is economically very, very meaningful. So the New Year Growth Plan has already the agenda. It has a time frame. And it already has the effect. All that is needed, because the momentum is there, is the momentum to be seized and taken seriously. As many of us have said, this process for the EU integration has been very long. So now that all the cards are on the side of the integration process for the Western Balkan, I think that the momentum can be seized, and I'm optimistic very much for the three countries that I mentioned, that Albania, North Macedonia, and Montenegro, that they can make it there in the future 5 to 7 years, up until 2030, I would say. I don't know what Simonida thinks.
Do you think this 5 to 7 year time frame is the right time frame to be looking at? And do you see the Western Balkans 6 dividing into these two groups, like Nina was saying?
I'm very wary of time frames for membership per se. What we've learned, for example, from the case of North Macedonia, I think that's kind of partly touched in the study, is that actually as a result of a very long alignment process, let's say the country was the first one to sign the Stabilization Association Agreement as, let's say, the basis for the legal alignment. In the first decade, when there was also a push from the EU by 2011, it managed to align itself substantially with EU legislation. So I think most of the progress, actually, if we take a look at the alignment level, which is very decent for North Macedonia in comparison to the fact that it's at the beginning of the formal accession negotiations. This is an indicator that a decade of devotion, probably for this was even less than a decade, because the country got its candidate status in 2005. So in 6 years, it did a lot, because that's the time span. And now with that alignment, we are comparable with Montenegro, which is closing its accession negotiations, even though we are at the start. But let's say the formal alignment is comparable with the countries which are much more formally advanced. So that shows that actually a relatively short amount of time can make a difference. And going back to Nina's point, from that perspective, then 2030 would not be off the grid. In a 4-year period would not be out of anyone's mind, because if you had asked us, let's say, before the growth plan, no one would say that a lot of things can change in 3 to 4 years. But it's evident if there is the push from the EU, just as, for example, now in the growth plan there is, with specific requirements of the countries to deliver every 6 months, then the pressure for delivery will be also stronger. And one of the, let's say, the advantages of this growth plan also that Nina mentioned is that it's likely to introduce a variable in the case of the Western Balkans that has been missing for a very long time, and that's actually competition between the countries. Because each of these countries has benchmarks that they need to fulfill on a semi-annual basis, and funds that are allocated to all of these reform steps. So it actually makes it very clear that some countries that will not deliver will not get the payments. This is modeled on the basis of the Recovery and Resilience Facility of the European Union. And it's hopefully to stir some positive competition within the region, which has been missing for a very long time. So probably the answer to your question is that with the right instruments, 5-7 years is not that much of a short time. I'm not sure that we're talking about actual membership, because that's in everyone's heads when we talk about deadlines. But this period can lead to a more transformative policy reform than we would otherwise expect it to be. And for example, I used to work in the government for some time, and for the EU back in the early 2000s, 5 to 7 years was actually a bit of a medium to long-term perspective. So it's not irrational to expect a change, despite what our experience of 2 decades shows us.
And how does the addition of Ukraine as a candidate country change the calculus in all of this?
From where we stand, I think that many people in the Western Balkans are grateful to Ukraine for kind of re-energizing this discussion on enlargement. It's tragic that it had to happen through an aggression and a war in Europe. But on the other hand, I'm sure that for many people, the size of Ukraine and the implications of what integrating Ukraine as a formal member of the European Union would mean at least in the short term, over the EU's budget and policies, raises questions. So on the one hand, people are aware that without there's in my circles, in the think tankers in the Western Balkans, we say that Ukraine is now at the front of the train, so they are the engine of the train. But it's also a question whether that engine will take maybe just so much of energy and so much of resources that we won't even get to the coaches that are in the back.
And as we head out of this podcast, what are some things that you, as someone who is not from the region, have learned about the Western Balkans during this research? And what would you like other people to learn or think about or start wondering about, given all of this?
Well, when I started to work on this paper, the first question I asked myself is why we are talking about Western Balkan 6, given that there are 6 different countries. And the more I delve into the topic, the more I learned that, yes, there are similarities. They share some history, they share languages, because the language is very similar across the region, but also they are very different. I think we have to acknowledge the difference in the region. Also from EU perspective, I think, acknowledge it and help this country to unlock their potential as much as we can do.
Nina, what do you wish people knew about the Western Balkans?
Well, I very much like what Anna said, and I'm grateful that she came to that conclusion, because I think this region has been a black box in many countries outside this region. So let me just chip into what Anna has said. I think because these economies have their specificities, and because there are different levels of the EU integration process, I believe that they deserve a country-specific approach by the EU. And I wish that this can happen in the future from the EU side. So rather than looking at the region through regional lenses, looking at the region through the micro or country level lenses. So this is what I would like to see in the future.
I know I would love to learn more about each and every one of the countries here, because certainly the joy of the EU is how it opens doors for us to learn about very specific places within this much larger market. Simonida, what have we not talked about yet that you think people need to keep in mind, or what would you like people to think about when they think about this area?
One of the things that probably I should have mentioned is that the region is not outside of the European Union. The region is actually inside the European Union, because it's basically engulfed by EU member states. So you have Greece, Bulgaria, and Italy on the other side. So the region is a very short. There are distances within the European Union. Probably the flight between Tallinn and Barcelona is longer than the flights to any of the Western Balkan countries from the EU. So it's really close. Our products, our food and our wine is usually in the EU, in most of the capitals in the EU, in the supermarkets. And it's the food that's considered very safe for the European Union. This region actually has some of the best organic foods that you can still find in Europe, despite our pollution in winter. So what I think that, where I would like to leave it at is that the region is really not that far. It's often not in the mental maps of many Europeans. And I'm hoping that with this podcast, we brought it a bit closer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for your time. Listeners, you've been with The Sound of Economics today. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie. I've been joined by Simonida Kaczarska from the European Policy Institute, coming to us from the Western Balkans, from Skopje in North Macedonia. We have Nina Vojanovic, Bruegel's first Western Balkans fellow, who recently moved to Brussels from Montenegro, and Anna Fiore, part of the research team. I'm Rebecca Christie, part of the research team. You can find all of their research and all of our events on our website, bruegel.org. Hope you will join us next time. Thanks for listening.